Thanks everyone for this. So yeah, we're gonna have a little fireside chat now with Clive Bradley, a very experienced screenwriter and showrunner. I've got a load of questions, and and as usual, I've over prepared. So these questions will probably last about 6 hours, so we won't get through them all. But I will leave some time for if people do have some questions. If Clive's happy to take them, we can do that. If you have anything you want to add, you're welcome to just drop it in the chat box, folks, and I'll keep my eye on that so that we don't interrupt Clive or whatever. But I can reach into there if there's anything that you want to add. So the topic of this video chat is from game franchise to hit TV animation, writing the narrative for Castlevania Nocturne. Now we're very lucky to have Clive with us. Clive was the I want to say showrunner, lead writer, executive producer on the animated series Castlevania Nocturne, which had a very successful run on Netflix last year. I think it launched in September last year, Clive, if I'm right.
Yep, end of September.
And of course, it's an adaptation of a long-running video game series, and also the follow-up to an animation that had already existed a couple of years before that. It's received a lot of critical acclaim, but also Clive's got a background in writing for other TV shows, live action TV shows, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So what I will do, first of all, Clive, just before I launch into my questions specifically about your process and about writing for TV and so on, and about adapting a game, which is a challenge in itself. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Please give us the elevator pitch for Clive Bradley and some of the things you've written.
So I've worked in film and television, mainly television. Starting my first show was broadcast in January, I think it was 2001. So I've been working professionally, I guess, since that period. So I've worked. So that was for an ITV crime show called The Vice, which I worked on for 3 years. I subsequently worked on I've done quite a lot of crime shows. I worked on Waking the Dead for the BBC. Most recently, although it isn't that recent anymore, which I'm sure we'll talk about a bit, I worked on 3 seasons of an Icelandic crime show called Trapped, which I wrote or co-wrote all of, and various other things. So yeah, so broadly speaking, that's my background. So in terms of broadcast work, a lot of it's crime of different kinds. One part of being a professional screenwriter is that you develop and write a ton of stuff that doesn't get made. And in fact, if you saw my portfolio more generally, it would be less crime specific. But that's the way the world works. So yeah, there you are.
That's interesting. I should also say you, I believe, won a BAFTA for a documentary that you did. Well, that's a docudrama you did called That Summer Day a few years ago.
Yes, yes. So we, it was for children's BBC, which again is not really my normal, wheelhouse. It was a children's drama about the July terrorist bombings in London, commissioned by the BBC. Yes, for which we won a BAFTA for Best Children's Drama.
Amazing. Thank you. Just before I get into my next question, I just for maybe the question that's on some people's minds here, you are obviously British, and how yet you wrote the Icelandic drama Trapped. How did you do that? Did you write in Icelandic?
Everybody in Iceland, literally everybody in Iceland speaks English. No, the way that worked was, so it was a project that the Icelandic company had developed and got to a certain point, and then because they were various international connections, I was brought in by the executive producer who I had worked with, who's German but lives in France. It's a very international thing. His name is Klaus Zimmermann, and then the way that it moved forward was that for that first season I wrote all of it in English, because also the principal financiers were not Icelandic. The main financiers for the first season was ZDF, which is the German public broadcasting company, and France Télévisions in France, and also a lot of the Scandinavian broadcasters, and of course none of them speak Icelandic. So in order for them to sign off on scripts, they had to be in English anyway. So I wrote the scripts in English, and they were then translated.
Perfect. Well, that gives us there's a few things there that we'll come back to, but it's a good segue because it makes me want to ask, since we're talking here about Castlevania Nocturne, was it a big leap then going from live action crime drama to game, an adaptation of a game into animation? Was there a for you? Was that a big change in your processes?
I think the answer is kind of yes and no. In some ways, yes. Certainly, the kind of game adaptation was a leap. Certainly, this I didn't really understand until after it came out, that there was an audience, and a audiences plural, really, which I've never encountered before as a result of it being an adaptation of a popular game.
Yes.
So there was stuff to kind of navigate there in terms of, I've worked on things which are adaptations before, but it's an adaptation of a different sort. I think really in terms of just the writing, not so much really. I mean, as I say, what I've written and interested in isn't just crime, and I've developed a few fantasy things. I love quite a lot of fantasy. Fantasy obviously is expensive to do as a TV thing. And so from that point of view, I didn't feel it was a huge leap in the dark in terms of it's obviously, as you know, it's a vampire thing. I'm a big fan of a lot of vampire things. I've watched Buffy from start to finish at least 4 times, I would think. My daughter was of an age during the pandemic when we could do it, so I watched it again. Big fan of the Anne Rice novels, so there I didn't feel like in terms of the dark fantasy thing that I was leaping into something I didn't know. And then in terms of actually writing it, I mean, I didn't feel there was a huge difference there, really.
Perfect. Well, we'll come back to that because I want to talk about the challenges and opportunities of adapting a game and processes you went about writing. We're talking about focusing particularly on the narrative here. So actually, on that note, then let's talk about how you go about. Since you say writing is writing, before we get into some specifics, what are your kind of specific? Maybe you don't have any, but do you have any kind of specific creative writing methods or processes? Are you a save the cat person, or do you kind of do you have any kind of particular ways to approach that blank sheet of paper?
Yeah, I mean, I think I do a lot of preparation. I don't know that it's necessarily exactly plotting, but it's just everything has a whole series of problems you have to crack, right? Whether it's, who is this character? What's that character's development going to be? How does that character connect to another character? Where do you want this to go? Where do you want it to end? How are you going to get to that point? A lot of the problems you have to crack are just to do with trying to make things make logical sense. Quite often, you have a whole load of different ideas that don't really make sense together. Or this isn't really true of, it's a different kind of thing with adapting a fundamentally quite simple game. But with a novel, for instance, you quite often find there are things in the novel that make any sense at all, and you have to kind of work through that. So I do a lot of thinking, and personally, I think at the keyboard. So I do a lot of just writing it down as it comes out of my head, and then eventually moving to script. In order to write the script, though, I always want quite a detailed outline.
Right.
And I teach quite a lot, and it's an important part of the process I find with students is to get quite a detailed outline. I mean, you might find when you start writing it that the outline's wrong, but still to know you're doing this, and then that happens, and then that happens, and that happens. I think there are writers who don't do that. But for me, it's an important part of the process.
Yeah, they do, because they do say there's the pantsers, isn't there? The writers who write by the seat of their pants and seem to make it up as they go along.
Yes.
But I recall Terry Pratchett saying that writing was like looking down into a valley that had some fog in it, maybe, but you could see the steeples working out, or the destination at the end of the valley, the buildings you wanted to get to, even if maybe the path itself was perhaps a little bit obscured.
Yeah, and I mean, I think with Terry Pratchett, you couldn't write those kind of tightly plotted things just by starting and hoping for the best.
Well,
it wouldn't be
no,
possible.
I think you're probably right. So on that note, then let's talk about Castlevania specifically and how you approach that with that in mind, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges of plotting it. So look, just to go to a point that you made already, you're not a Castlevania player before you got there. The game series has been around for almost 20 years, I think, but you weren't a player.
No.
So when you got the commission to write the series, how did you go about getting everything you need together? You mentioned kind of research and things. How do you research and immerse yourself in the lore of a game with that many elements to it already?
Yes, it was slightly different because there was a pre-existing show on Netflix,
Mm.
which what I was doing was a kind of sequel, spin-off, successor to, and I was a fan of that.
Right. Oh, okay.
That's why I was interested in the thing to begin with. It's because I was already a fan of Castlevania.
Mm.
The last there was 4 seasons of it, and the fourth season hadn't been broadcast yet, and so I got sent that to watch. So I had in terms of the already existing adaptation, I knew that quite well. In terms of the game, I mean, it's just you Google stuff and read it and do as much as you can to understand it.
Yeah.
Um, then, of course, when it comes to the process itself, there are lots of people involved in it, including Kevin Calder, who was the American producer that who hired me basically, and then also Sam and Adam Dietz, who are the directors who I've worked with very closely, who are fans of the game. So, and because screenwriting it's true, it's a thing people say, and it's true, it's a very collaborative process. That from quite early on, you're engaged with people who do have that that background and that understanding. So you're not just kind of, excuse me, flying by the seat of your pants.
Yeah.
You're involved with other people.
That's good, and we'll talk about the collaborative nature of screenwriting shortly. But on Castlevania, then obviously you'd seen the series, you had a team around you that knew the games. Castlevania Nocturne is set very specifically. It's not the same as the previous show. It's set during the French Revolution. But what key elements of the Castlevania games and the story and the specific parts of the series that it was based on, did you think were essential to maintain? How did you stay true to that source material and adapt that for what you were trying to do?
Yes, and obviously, I mean that it is a difficult line to walk because um, obviously there's no point in referring to the game at all if it's got nothing to do with it.
Mm.
And but the game, the first, there were two that were sort of in the mix, but both were slightly problematic as adaptations for different reasons. Which is Rondo of Blood and Symphony of the Night. Symphony of the Night being the most popular and famous of all the Castlevania games. Both of them feature a character called Richter Belmont, who is the descendant of the character Trevor Belmont, and Cypher, who were the main characters in the original Castlevania show. So what was absolutely clear was that this had to be a show about Richter Belmont. Now the game, Rondo of Blood, is just Richter running around I mean, forgive me if you're fans of it and it sounds reductive and dismissive, but fundamentally the game is Richter running around rescuing people. And there's not and the commission was for 8 episodes to begin with, and that wasn't going to do 8 episodes. You can't sustain a story. That's too simple a story. It might, it works as a game. It might work possibly for an hour.
Yeah.
But for anything longer than that, it wasn't possible. So it was a question for me of looking at something in the material that could generate something more fruitful, give more story than just that. And the thing that really grabbed me is that the game says, I mean, in the game it doesn't really make anything of it, but the game says it's set in 1792, and then Symphony of the Night is in 1796. And so, for me, I'm a bit of a history nerd. 1792 is the middle of the French Revolution. So my pitch was, let's put it there. And really, it took off from there. So then once that's the kind of the setting, I wanted to ground it as much as you can with a story about vampires and demons in history. So it's a question of thinking, well, where are the vampires in this mix? And so there are whole sort of questions that were posed by the setting that suggested itself as to where the characters would be. So Maria Renard, who's another important character in the game, who's a bit younger than Richter, we slightly tweaked the relationships between them. And there's a character, Tara, in the game, who we made her mother. So there were things that we fiddled with a bit to make it more compact. But then the idea that Maria is, really excited on the side of the revolution. The vampires are going to be their enemies. Who else is in the mix? In fact, the established church was very hostile to the revolution, so there was something fruitful to explore there. So the historical setting gave a set of possibilities, which then the characters in the story could explore. For me, another very crucial thing is, for me, the most radical thing the French Revolution did was abolish slavery, way long before it was abolished in America or anywhere else. But the reason they did that was because there was a revolution by slaves in a French colony, which was called Saint-Domingue, then is now called Haiti. And so I wanted to include that somehow. So we had this character who comes to France, who's from Saint-Domingue, who's a revolutionary witch, bringing her friend with her. And obviously, therefore, probably there's going to be some development of a relationship between Richter and her. Well, in the game, he has a girlfriend called Annette, which is quite a French name, so used that. This proved quite controversial, but that was how that thought process evolved.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
That's right. It's okay. I didn't hear it actually, so that's cool. So no, but that's interesting, and it gives me lots of questions that I have for you. The next one is, I guess, just from there, because you mentioned about how you're working on these storylines and how you crack them. You're also, I think, not working alone. So we talked about how collaborative it is working on a TV project. You ran a writer's room, I think, for this, right? So you weren't the only writer on it. You were the showrunner, and you plotted it. So can you tell us a little bit about that? What is it like working with other writers, and how did you maintain a sort of consistent, make all those threads that you just spoke about work with other writers on it? I mean, was it very collaborative, or did you tell people exactly what to write? How does that all work?
So it wasn't. So the previous series of Castlevania didn't have a writer's room. It was just one writer or another. I wanted to try out having a room for it. It was also partly the kind of evolution of it was that there was going to be this Haitian Saint-Domingue character who was a former enslaved woman who does magic. Her magic probably therefore needed to have West African origins. How do we include that so we make it more authentic? So I started, but in the end, there were 3 writers I met in the course of trying to do something around that, who I thought were great and would be very good in a room. So I did. Now, as I say, it wasn't planned. It therefore wasn't. We had to find room in the budget for it, and it was the middle of the pandemic. So
wow.
What we actually did was a week like this.
Or just on Zoom?
Just on Zoom. I didn't meet them in the flesh until later. So I'd obviously done quite a lot of work on the overall shape of the story, but then in that week we dug into it in quite a lot of detail, and I think collectively came up with some great new things, and then it was a question of them deciding which episodes they were going to write, or they wanted to write, and then spend particular time focusing on those episodes. So obviously, part of what goes with the territory of a showrunner is that you are likely. I mean, it's not inevitable, but you're likely to be doing some overwriting, as it's called, in order to maintain the singularity of kind of voice and sensibility, all of that. I did very little, in fact. So as I think they would agree that they were quite and then after the week we had a lot of chat. And then obviously when people go into writing their scripts, then there's a whole process you go through of they submit the scripts, you give notes and all of that. So and in fact what we did was we did a whole process of that before giving it to anyone in America.
Right.
So that I think that the it was still quite I certainly wasn't just saying here's the outline, go and do it.
Right. That's interesting. In fact, I do want to come back to some of the story decisions you made, but that's a really interesting point you just made there about having the scripts and sending them off, because I'm interested as well here in the fact that you were working with an established IP, Castlevania franchise. There's a number of stakeholders in that as well. So you were making a show for Netflix, but also Konami presumably have got opinions about what happens to the Castlevania brand. So what was that like working with those stakeholders? I mean, did all your scripts have to be signed off by somebody at Konami, or did you get story notes from those guys?
I think Konami did give notes. They gave notes to Kevin in America. I think he protected me from them quite a lot. So I only occasionally heard what the Konami notes. I mean, they were very few. Konami were not at all, you know, precious or interfering about it. In fact, quite often their notes were quite puzzling. Like I remember one of their notes was that I had a character. In fact, we lost this moment because the character couldn't sing it. But I had a character walking off at the end of one of a scene singing the Marseillaise, which is the French national anthem, and was a French revolutionary song. And Konami insisted that it hadn't been written yet. That was their note. Master hadn't been written yet. He couldn't be singing it.
So not checking on the IP, but on your knowledge of French history.
I was delighted to be able to prove that they were wrong and it had been. But no, so they were unhappy about, again, one of the slogans we had written on a wall because they didn't think it was historically accurate. So it was quite surprising the few comments we did from Konami weren't quite what you'd think.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Again, Netflix were pretty hands off, to be honest. Yeah, our relationship with Netflix animation has been good.
Yeah, that's interesting because and good to hear, because I assume that when someone is writing playing in somebody else's sandbox and working with established characters, that the IP owner would be very hands-on, and I'm sure that is probably true for some franchises. But it sounds like you were given quite a long leash. Is that the right phrase to do what you wanted with it?
Yeah. Yes, for sure.
That's interesting. That's good. So so kind of back to the what you were able to do with it then, and how you were able to adapt what was quite a straightforward video game into this complex narrative. You were tackling some kind of big themes in the story. I mean, you mentioned the revolution of the enslaved people in Haiti, but also, and you mentioned the church as well. You had to sort of establish for the story that the vampires were on the side of the aristocracy and that the church played a huge role in your story. I mean, can you talk us through some of the themes there? I mean, there seems to be quite a lot of religious and political themes going on there, and some kind of class statements and stuff. Was that an intention? Were you deliberately kind of working on things like that as you were writing the story?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are things there that I felt that the historical setting kind of demands of you. I mean, the original Castlevania show was quite critical of the church, so I wasn't really sort of doing anything particularly new there. And there are critics of what we've done who feel that it's unfair to the church and stuff. I mean, it's historically true. The established church was on the on the side of the counter-revolution. I mean, I'm sure from their point of view with good cause, but they were. But I think that the main character who expresses that, who is the abbot, is, I think, a complex, conflicted character. I don't think he's simply evil by any stretch of the imagination. He believes he's doing something for the good of the church, which he thinks is the same thing as the good of humanity. So we were keen to not be just sort of simplistic about everything. Obviously you're in a genre which is, and you've got episodes of about 25 minutes on the whole. So there's a limit to exactly what you can. But and at least one of the writers' room is a practicing Christian. So anyway, so yes, so there were things that were presented by the history, and yeah, of course, to me, it's a story about freedom, and there are things I wanted to talk about and play out in that, which felt like, as a writer for television and television-like things, you're always being asked to do, and trying to do, is things which speak to the world now. Themes to do with freedom and racism and power and all of those things. Yeah, absolutely wanted to get into all that.
Great. Now, actually, on that note, then the vampires are on the side of the aristocracy. The vampires aren't that they're part of the counter-revolution. They're opposing our heroes. I mean, was that an obvious choice? As you were looking at the setting and you looked at the French Revolution, obviously you've got the original story there, which doesn't really do very much with the revolution, and you're looking at that. I mean, how did you decide, where the vampires would fit into the story? How do you? I mean, you mentioned all your your influences as well. I mean, how did you draw on sort of vampire lore and figure out how it would all fit into your setting?
Um, it wasn't straightforward. I think for Kevin, who's the American exec producer, I think it was more straightforward than it was for me. So because obviously because he'd done the previous show and steeped in all of that, and so the vampires as they had existed in the original Castlevania very much were, you know, part of the aristocracy. They were more likely to be connected to the aristocracy than anything else. I remember originally having an idea which was quite sort of Anne Rice influence, that the in the 300 years since the original show, a lot of vampires have become sort of destitute and were kind of lurking around graveyards, being you know grabbing what they could get. But in the end, we went with the much simpler idea and also, of course, there's the sense of the aristocracy as being like vampires is
Right, yeah.
metaphorically too. So the kind of combination of those two things, it made sense to do that. And certainly when it came to Sandamang and the Annette story, having her slave owner as a vampire just seemed obvious.
Right.
And obviously, and then it gave you a story with her about him. So the sense, therefore, the revolution and the vampires being on opposite sides just seemed to present itself in the end as kind of obvious.
Just as made me think there, obviously the process of preparing this, you come up with 1,000 ideas. Are there loads of ideas as you write and as you prepare that end up on the cutting room floor, if you like? Are there ideas that you have to discard? And do you regret some of those? Or, do you kind of think, oh, you have to kill your babies and
yeah, God, yes. I mean, in terms of what because we're currently making season 2, so I'm having to try and remember what I can't talk about. Yes, there are going to be avenues you go down, even whole kind of characters that in the end, I mean, there are quite a lot of characters. It's and so therefore there are quite a lot of arcs, as we say, to follow through in season 2. And yeah, there are always things that you'd like to do. I mean, at the moment, I've been Netflix commissioned season 2, so we're working on that. We're not far off completing it. And so obviously thinking about what a season 3 might be, and I've gone through, I don't know, 20 different ideas for what to do for season 3. So yes, but that is an inevitable part of the writing process. Is well, as the famous phrase has it, I think it's William Faulkner originally, "Kill your darlings," i.e. that you have to kill the things you most love. It's true.
So let's go from there to the characters that you've got and the character arcs that you've created. I mean, you mentioned Richter Belmont and Maria there in the game, and so is Olrox, who's actually a big part of this. Is actually I think a boss or maybe a sub boss or something in the game. But great there. So how do you take an established character from a game and then flesh them out and give them the story arc and the personality in a way that feels true to the source, but also something that is very much yours and that you feel is compelling for the audience? How do you go about developing those?
So with Richter, the key things from the game, I think, are that he's very strong. He's I think he's often talked about as being the physically strongest Belmont. There are different designs of Richter, but the one we modelled ours on was a particular one where he's physically strong. And he's he's a Belmont. He's got the whip. He's got all the Belmont characteristics. For me, the really important thing was to make him not like Trevor.
The character who had led the previous
Trevor Belmont from the previous show. Trevor is kind of cynical, drinks a lot, gets involved in the story very reluctantly. He has a kind of classic refuses the call to adventure thing, which is an element of a certain type of storytelling. He's very kind of cynical and snarky and all that. but the whole point to him is that he's been through a lot. He's, you know, he's seen it all, and that he's that kind of character. Um, but again, within the source material, Richter is 19. So went from there really. What would the character be like who's 19? And decided, I can't remember exactly at what point decided that, but we began the whole thing with a you know, traumatic experience for him. And so then the idea that this character that he's not, you know, he's been killing vampires, but he's not been killing really difficult vampires. And that he's you know, he's cocky but young. He's, you know, he's good and strong and powerful, but actually when he starts to get into this story, he's completely out of his depth. And that seemed to me a way to make the character interesting and to give the character an arc. I mean, people talk about arcs. I think the phrase, you know, it implies that shape, which implies something about about the beginning and the end and what transforms between them. And so, in order for a character to have an arc, to have development, to go somewhere, you need to find the point at the beginning, which is as far away really from where you want them to go as you can. Obviously, that can be, you can take that to stupid extremes, but so that to me, that Richter was cocky but actually out of his depth,
Right.
And the thing which was haunting him would appear and scare the living daylights out of him. Seemed to me a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, tell us about Ulrox as well. So Ulrox is an interesting character. I found him a you know, very compelling character to watch, and you sort of created him. He's very ambiguous. He's not quite the big villain of the story. I mean, he's obviously not on the same side, but then kind of, but you created that kind of quite conflicted character out of not very much source material, I guess. I mean, tell
Yeah,
us a
I
little
mean,
bit.
I can't remember at what point I thought I wanted to make Ulrox a kind of Native American, and then that kind of evolved into Aztec. I actually resisted making him Aztec for a while because I thought it was too obvious, and I wanted him to be. But in the end, it was just so simple to you can explain what he is in a word, which went given that you don't have, as I say, very much time for anything in this format. It was so simple to just say, okay, he's Aztec. Okay, I get it. I can't remember exactly why. At what point I thought that was a good idea, but once I had the idea, I really liked it, and it seemed again. So you have this. I mean, you know, it's a criticism we've had, which I think, as far as it goes, is a fair enough criticism, that the kind of origin story, if you like, at the beginning is not the most original. That Richter sees his mother killed. I mean, you know, seen that before. That's true. But then what's interesting to me is who's the killer. And so to put that character on a journey and discover things about the character, which means that you set them up to be, oh, they're the big bad. They're the you know the monster that has to be destroyed at the end. But you start to realize actually that's not the case. But it's more complicated than that. That to me was the thing that was interesting to then play out. And so yes, I, I mentioned Anne Rice. I don't know if any of you know any of the Anne Rice novels, but Ulrox to me is quite a kind of Anne Rice character.
Right.
He's this sort of yeah, he'll kill you, but he might not, and he kind of enjoys it and actually quite likes people.
Right.
Um,
For those maybe who haven't, who aren't familiar, Anne Rice is the Interview with the Vampire writer, right? That's perhaps her most famous, a Vampire Lestat. That's her most famous.
yes, and there's a fantastic series of it, which on JMC have done, which season 2 apparently has started in America, which I think is really good.
Okay.
I've been
But yeah, he's got that sort of slightly flamboyant. You get the sense that he maybe enjoys being he quite enjoys being a vampire, but also being around people as well. The
Yes,
character, yeah,
yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
That's great. I mean, so let's talk about some of the other bits then from there. And I should point out to everyone, we're about 2/3 of the way through the time we've allowed for this. So if we've got I've got plenty more questions, but if anyone does have any questions for Clive, this would be a great chance to, I don't know, however you want to do it, drop it into the chat or raise your hand or something. I can keep my eye open. So so let's talk about your process then of the craft of it. how does well, you mentioned earlier on about writing for animation, and your previous work has been live action. The process you described of coming up with ideas and characters, I presume, takes place much the same from different types of narrative. But were there any kind of unique opportunities or that the animated format presented? I mean, were you able to do things that, again, you mentioned earlier on about the fantasy obviously needs a huge budget. Were you able to do more because it was animation? Did you, were you free to invent?
Yes, within limits. One of the things I quite quickly learned was that scenes with lots of people, so for instance, mass battles, that kind of thing, are I mean, you can do them, but it's not as straightforward as you might think, because they have to be drawn, and the animators don't like doing just they're all the same. So in fact, I mean, the original Castlevania series did have battles, and we might, but and also, of course, the drawing and then the animating is a very time-consuming process. So things which as live action, even just a fight between two people, to draw and animate it is actually quite complicated. So what they call a shot in animation is what you might think of in live action as just a kind of particular placement of the camera. And also, I started to realize, I quite quickly realized that the team, the production team, the artists and so on, all in Texas actually, are very inventive and great. So in the early scripts, I would outline battles in some detail. They would invariably think of something a bit smarter than I'd thought of. And so I think by the end of season 2, which we're doing at the moment, I mean, there's much more of a kind of they fight stage direction.
Right.
Though I actually have to be a bit careful, because you still on the script want the kind of the sort of proportions between different bits of action. You're still trying to control as the writer. So the risk with they fight is that they think, oh, that's 20 seconds. And actually, you meant I want this to be a big fight.
Right. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you still have to, and obviously you can talk about, but in terms of how it reads on the page, you're still trying to give a sense of, generally speaking, in a screenplay, it's about a minute a page, and that's true here too. So,
Okay.
the scripts were about 25 pages, that sort of length. Some of them a bit longer.
Right, that's interesting. It's funny you said that about the direction for things like fights. I remember it's not on the screen, but a comics writer Tony Lee telling me a story once that he wrote a script for a comic, and at the end of like chapter 1 or whatever, he said that the villain is shot. And so they went away, and the illustrator drew this amazing picture of this guy being shot and blood and everything. And then the start of chapter 2 was, but it passes through him and that doesn't do any harm. And like, oh no! So yeah, they had to kind of completely redo the last panel. So I guess you have to make sure that the animators know what your intention is for that.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Right. So look, what about any kind of limitations then about and sort of the process of animation? Do you ever see things and think, "Oh, that's not what I intended"? Do you get to pass notes back to the animators the way you do to the script writers?
I mean, on this, I'm an executive producer, so yeah, I get to see the animatics, which is a kind of rough version of the animation, give notes on that, and then when the actual animation is done in Korea, when it comes back from there, then we give notes. Usually, what will happen is the editor will do a rough assembly of all the animated stuff. So I see that, and actually, I think probably in the early days of doing, because I started work on season 1 in 2021,
right.
So I've been working on it for a while, and obviously I've learned stuff. One of the things I've learned is that there are a lot of people who are much better at giving notes on this kind of thing than I am. So I tend to be a bit more kind of I'll wait and see a proper cut before I start mouthing off, because they probably know that already. What's the point in pointing that out? But yes, no, but yes, I'm very involved in all stages of that, right up to we just did a sound mix, a final sound mix on an episode in episode 5 in season 2 on Tuesday.
Right.
So I was involved in that.
That's really interesting about the timescales involved. So you started writing in 2021. You mentioned the writer's room, about a page a minute on the script. Like, how long does it take to write a show like this? So how long did it take to write season 2, for instance, just to give us a bit of a sense of?
I think the whole process of writing, so that we'd signed and everybody signed off on all the scripts, was probably 8 episodes, a bit under a year.
Okay.
I think.
How long does it take you personally to feel comfortable? I know this is how long is a piece of string, comfortable with the script. Now, from idea to writing the script and
So
editing
you've normally got about a month.
Right. Okay.
So that's on top of whatever work you may have done in advance in terms of working out the overall story and that kind of thing. But to actually write the script through however many, you hope 2 drafts, it might be 7. I would say about a month.
We've got a question from Patty here. Thanks, Patty. Before I come to it, I've got a couple of questions I want to ask you before the end as well. But Patty asks, how do you balance creative freedom and historical accuracy? How did that influence your process?
I mean, because we're obviously in a fantasy version of reality, then if the worst comes to worst, then you're not going to agonize about history. We tried to keep it as certainly the kind of basic chronology of things as accurate as possible. So it starts at a certain point in 1792, which was just after the king had been arrested. The Haitian Revolution, the Saint-Domingue Revolution, had started a year earlier. So when we see that in episode 3, that's the kind of time scale. In fact, the execution of the king, which we're going to get to, was January 93. And slight spoiler, that happens.
Yeah.
But we've slightly cheated we've telescoped it. So it isn't really, it really would be what, sort of September and it isn't. We've shortened it. But for instance, the reason it's set in the part of France it's set in, the Vendée, is that the Vendée was where there was the big counter-revolutionary movement in 1793, which started before. So it's set in Western France because that's where the counter-revolution was strongest. And so that kind of thing is tied, obviously not dogmatically, to history as far as it seemed sensible to do.
That's interesting. Well, actually, I guess my next question is kind of adjacent. It's not the same, but you're also writing as well as these other things. You're writing a beloved IP. You must be conscious when you're writing it that there is an audience there. As you said, you mentioned right at the top of this conversation that there's an existing fan base for both the games and for the previous show. So were you kind of conscious of them looking over your shoulder? I mean, how did you stay? Were you conscious of trying to please the fans? Are the reception has been good, by the way, hasn't it? It's been very positive. But were you kind of conscious of the hardcore fans looking over your shoulder as you were writing?
I think going forward, I would be much more conscious than I was. I was conscious. Obviously, that it's a beloved IP, and you hope that you're going to please fans of the game. But I think the thing is that there are several fan bases or potential fan bases. So there's the fans of the game, there's the fans of the original animation, which may or may not be the same people. I mean, to some degree, it won't be the same people.
Yeah.
And obviously, you're hoping that you find new fans who are neither.
Yeah.
And I certainly think it was a thing that we discussed several times in the writing process, that we couldn't use wanting to please, that we couldn't bend too far to pleasing the fans of the game, so that we lost the actual story development, which made sense.
Yeah.
That you could cripple yourself if you tried too much to like, for instance, there are 2 big criticisms we've had. One is people don't like the fact that we made Annette. Annette in the game is a blonde girl in a castle being rescued. That we made her this Haitian revolutionary. There are people who don't like that. I don't really care about that criticism. and she's not really a character. It's not like we took if we'd done that with Richter, I could understand what people said about it. But we didn't. It's an entirely secondary character in the game, and it's really just she's got her name.
Yeah.
But the other thing that people didn't like, some people didn't like, was that they didn't like Richter being vulnerable and scared and crying, and because they felt that their guy from the game wouldn't do that. But as I've explained, to me, you absolutely have to do that. If all you've got is a character who's strong and goes around beating people up, then
what's the story?
It's not an interesting character. What who would want to write that character? That making him vulnerable and a kid who's got a journey to go on makes him a much more compelling character. And if that pisses off some people who are fans of the game, then I just think that's what can you do? That's c'est la vie.
Yeah, exactly. As you said, you can't make two seasons of a show or more out of a person who's not on any kind of emotional journey. You just walks around a castle. I'm conscious that we're sort of coming up to the end of time. Does anyone else have any questions for Clive while we're here? There's an opinion that writing serves as a form of personal therapy for the author. What do you think about this perspective? How much of yourself do you put into the stories you create? Great question. Thanks, Nikita.
I'm a vampire hunter. I think there is always something of yourself that what remove obviously is a question, but I think in a way even with your villains, you have to find something of yourself really in order to write them. It's one of the slight difficulties in a way when you're writing villains is that you always have to. I mean, the most interesting villains anyway are the ones which are not simply evil and horrible and ghastly. I mean, I've Elizabeth, who is the real big bad in to use the Buffy phrase in here is of the kind of villainous characters is the least interesting. Which if because she is basically just kind of mad and crazy, but if that's all there was, then I think we would have failed quite badly. But I think there are other Olrox and Drolta and the Abbot. I think are all kind of interesting, complex characters. So I'm not worried about that. And in all of them, I guess there's something, maybe not Drolta, certainly in the Abbot. The Abbot's, how far do you go doing something bad in order to do something you think is good? That feels like a dilemma that speaks to lots of things. Is it therapy though? I don't know if it's therapy. Don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, you have to find the thing that you connect with, and emotionally or in some way.
Are there any themes that connect the stories that you've written over time? So not just Castlevania, but your previous work and the film that you wrote and Trapped and the City of Vice and so on. Could someone look at all those and go, aha, this is a Clive Bradley story. These are the things that he's always in front of his mind.
People tell me they can.
Okay.
I think there's something to do with what kind of creature are we, human beings? Are we we're capable of doing terrible things, but also capable of doing really great things. And where do we really sit in all of that? So I think because there's something sort of political in quite a lot of what I do, but I don't think it's quite sort of I don't think what I write is polemical. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. You're not preaching
yeah. I mean, again, a criticism we had was that some people didn't like the show, felt that we were lecturing them about slavery. To me, which is bewildering. I took it for granted slavery is a bad thing. Politics explained to anybody that slavery was bad. Yeah. What we did decide to do was tell a story that people don't know about the revolution in Saint-Domingue in 1791. Yeah. Which is a story people don't know that I think they should. It's good for people to know. And if that's lecturing, then I'm sorry, but I think it's an episode, a thing that happened in history that is fascinating and worth getting into.
Absolutely, and you know, as you say, fits very naturally, I think, with the story of the revolution that you're telling, and also the way that vampires fit into that kind of the kind of universe
Yeah,
that you've
exactly. Yeah.
created. You know.
Yes, exactly. It felt like it worked so well that it would be neglectful not to do it.
Cool. I mean, if anyone else has got any questions, do shout in there. But I'll say, so look, like Clive, what else are you working on now? Okay, without giving us any spoilers, and I appreciate you probably under NDA, but we know you're working on season 2. But is there anything you can either tell us about that or other projects that you've got on your drawing board at the moment?
Um, I'm working on a few things. The thing, it's early days, so I won't. I'm working on, again. It's a thing I've tried to do a few times is do a kind of mixed genre thing, including fantasy. So I've tried a few times with various different companies to set up a supernatural crime show.
Okay,
Um, and I think I have wood up here, which I'm touching. That's what I'm
okay,
doing.
right.
I'm working with a Canadian First Nations company
Okay,
who are great,
great.
called Resolution Pictures, who I know quite well, and we've got a project which is that it's a supernatural crime show set on a native reserve in Ontario,
Oh wow.
which I'm very excited about. So that I hope that I will be able to tell you in more detail soon.
That's great. No, that's very cool. And what about video games? Have you got of your now you've got this is the second season of Castlevania. Have you had a taste for video game adaptations? Can you see other potential there for?
I mean, sure. I mean, the thing about that, of course, is that I mean there are quite a lot being done, and um, it's not just with games, but with generally the industries. So film
Yeah,
and television and streamers are all very. They all still want IP, as they call it, intellectual property. So you develop something which is based on an existing thing,
yeah.
whether it's a video game or a book or a graphic novel or whatever it is. Um, so there've been, obviously games recently. There was obviously The Last of Us, then there's Arcane, then there's
Halo, Fallout. Fallout's been
Halo,
great.
Fallout, exactly. So
Yeah,
so there've been a lot. And the thing there, of course, is that all of that IP has been snapped up by big companies. Um, so I have had, chats with smaller companies, but finding an intellectual property which is available to do is not easy.
for
That's
sure.
true of books too. I
Yeah,
mean, companies, film companies, production companies, literally have a person, all of them, whose job is to keep their eye on what new books are coming out and then option them before they even come out,
yeah.
so that they have, you know, they have the rights.
Yeah.
It's
It's an
an
industry, isn't it?
yes.
Interesting. That's interesting. In it, you met the video games there. I mean, you're right with Castlevania, right there at the heart of something, a phenomenon, I think, which is happening now, which you wouldn't even have thought about 10 years ago, which is video games as kind of the engine room for a lot of this IP. It used to be that think about a video game adaptation, and you might think of the terrible Super Mario Brothers movie from 20 years ago or something. But now with things like The Last of Us and so on, they're very very critically acclaimed. So we've got a question here, which will probably be our final one. What's easier, in your opinion, to add vampires to a historical situation, or to come up with a historical background for a vampire story? What's more creatively rewarding?
Um, I suspect that you can do either. I mean, I think I am sure you can put vampires in any historical situation.
Yeah.
So a historical situation that you find interesting and evocative and all of that, and put vampires in it. I'm sure you can do that. The question then is just to kind of work out what is your vampire lore. Because obviously there is kind of general vampire lore to some degree, but then each vampire universe has its own specific stuff. And I think coming up with something fresh is always good. Some different, the True Blood, for instance, the idea that vampires can come out of the shadows because they can drink artificial blood, so they can now live peacefully if they want to with people. But there's a hugely evocative idea in the middle of that. But then, yeah, yes, and so I think whatever works for you would be my answer to that.
My
Um,
one of my favorites books actually is The Stress of Her Regard. Having said that, I've temporarily forgot the name of the author. I'll look it up, but which places vampires as the explanation for some of the weird behaviour of Lord Byron
Oh, right.
and how things like Mary Shelley and Frankenstein were actually inspired by genuinely supernatural goings on. It's a great read, The Stress of Her Regard.
Arguably, the first vampire 19th century vampire novel comes from that.
Yeah.
So,
I think Polidori is actually in that book as well. He ties it all together in the thing. Yeah.
Right.
So I think, look, we're at 11 o'clock. We're at the top of the, we had an hour. I know, Clive, you've got other things to get back to. And if no one else has any other questions there, or there we go. Oh, thank you, Daria. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I think we're good. So thanks, Daria, for there, and thanks very much to Clive for your time. I know
Thank
we're
you.
all amazing. So I get a little virtual round of applause from all of us here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I hope that was useful for everyone. And Clive, thanks very much for sharing your experience with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.